Starting in 1914, when the world was striving for progress, the Great War came to our doors and accelerated technological advancement. Inventions such as machine guns, aerial reconnaissance, new medical treatments, radio, wireless communication, and chemical warfare influence our world today as much as in those times of need. All those innovations changed the world, tactics, and strategies in wars to come. But was the worldwide technological advancement the outcome of the First World War?
The story of radio started back in 1894, when Guglielmo Marconi started working on sending and receiving radio waves. After 1 year of hard work, the connectivity of 1 kilometer was reached. In 1899, the first signal crossed the English Channel. Shortly after that, Marconi went to the United States, where he continued his studies and created a company. At the beginning of the 20th century, the first transatlantic signal from Ireland to Canada was received. Another scientist, Nikola Tesla, contributed to the creation of the radio. As the First World War began, radio was widely used for communication on both long and short distances. It helped notifying soldiers about upcoming gas attacks and helping airplanes contact the Earth. However, this was a very unreliable source, since it could have been easily interrupted. Moreover, the devices were heavy and hard to transfer. The researcher from Passendale Research Center, Karen Dankely, confirms
they used it more and more in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917, especially for communication with artillery, to know where to aim to, and also to communicate with the ground troops, to know where they were. I think people then had to learn how to use them, that it wasn't so simple. And you had the big ones and the small ones, depended on range of signals. The small ones they could use in the trenches, but they only could reach like 1 to 2 kilometers, give a signal 1 to 2 kilometers. And the bigger ones had to use them in the rear, and they had a signal between 8 to 10 kilometers. So it's not like today you can receive signals from everywhere.
Electrical phones as well as radios took their roots from the telegraph. The electrical phone as we know it came to be as a result of hard work of many people. Disagreements exist based on who is responsible for the invention. But what we know is that on the 20th of January 1876, Alexander Graham Bell signed his patent application for the telephone. It was described as an apparatus for transmitting vocal or other sounds telegraphically. However, that wasn't it. The work on the telephone exchange began, and the main creator and initiator in this field was Hungarian engineer Tivadar Puskas. Slowly, step by step, telephone industry began to develop not only in the USA, but in Europe too. As the World War I shook, the word telephony was adapted to suit the new need of the society. Field phones were introduced with batteries or wind-up generators attached to them. Wireless sets were highly in demand as they suited perfectly for the war conditions, but only a small number of them was available. Moreover, as well as radios, such devices were heavy and uncomfortable to carry. Phones were mostly used on battlefields for connection between different units, but it wasn't the only case. When the American Expeditionary Force arrived in France in 1917, it faced many problems with communication due to the language barriers. As a result, Washington was urged to recruit American bilingual telephone operators to get timely and accurate battle reports, and this is how the Hello Girls were created. They were sent to France to do their job and record the messages they were receiving. Miss Beth Hunt of Berkeley, California, recalled of their arrival.
When we arrived on September 26, we found ourselves in a French camp that had been used for over 4 years. The barracks were flimsy things that had been lined with old newspapers and maps to keep out the cold. The YWCA helped us out by giving us a blanket each, a rug, oilcloths, and other comforts. In fact, our sitting room, which we acquired later, was furnished with a piano and other things.
Unfortunately, their dedication was fast forgotten as the war finished, and they came back home with memories of time when they helped the Allied war effort. After the Great War was over, the telephone continued its development, and in the 1960s first mobile phones began to emerge. And since then, they continue to improve and surprise us with more and more features as well as thinner and thinner designs.
And last, but definitely not least, moving pictures of films. Despite that first motion pictures appeared in 1890s, they were mostly focused on movement and had no plot or sound. Collection of 15 to 30 minute scenarios created by Lumiere brothers were one of the first movies shorts. During the second phase, which emerged at the beginning of 20th century, directors started to tell stories through their films. Nevertheless, the time of such movie didn't exceed 8 minutes, and they were called one-reelers due to the fact that they had just one reel of film. By the 1905, movies making was becoming more and more popular, and soon became a successful new industry. As a result, in 1912, Hollywood was established. While talking about Hollywood, around this time there is no way we can omit such figure as Charlie Chaplin. He became a famous actor around the time of the Great World War. In 1918, the silent comedy called Shoulder Army appeared on the screens. Before the production, Chaplin had doubts concerning the question, is it appropriate to use the bloodiest conflict in the history for humor? Nevertheless, as we all know, tragedy and comedy go hand in hand. So Chaplin decided to release this short movie. It is considered to be one of his popular films, which is both strongly criticized and praised. According to the professor Mark Connolly of the University of Kent, during the World War I,
the film industries of many nations, especially the USA, carried on producing pure entertainment as well as more overt propaganda. From the perspective of competent governments, cinema was there to inform, persuade, and encourage their home fronts and influential neutrals of the justice of their cause and the need for everyone to play a full role, accepting great sacrifices and hardships as part of the struggle. Also, despite the war, movies were popularized and shown to everyone. Commercial production companies continue to have their products shown in cinemas as part of the normal exhibition business, but officially produced material tended to be exhibited more widely. Town halls, sports clubs, and similar types of public spaces. Films were even shown to soldiers at the front in temporary cinema huts and tents.
Movies were present on the first lines of the battle, but the extent the war influences the filmmaking industry is also crucial. After that, the film industry was developing at accelerated pace. In 1932, another major improvement was made, Technicolor. Currently, movie and TV industries are working together to create the best content possible.
Propaganda. Information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. From the beginning of World War I, both sides of the conflict used propaganda to shape international opinion. Governments during the First World War devoted massive resources and huge amounts of effort to producing material designed to shape opinion and action internationally. The efforts of states to justify their actions and to build international support resulted in some of the most powerful propaganda ever produced. They also shaped attitudes towards propaganda itself in the years following the end of the war.
When the government is taking the decision to start a war, they're not doing it by themselves. Well, they're making the decision, but they're not doing it. From that moment on, it becomes quite important to convince your own people that the war is necessary, that it's good to have this war, that everything that goes wrong will be much better after the war and keep on going on. So you have to convince your people how necessary it is to have this war. And propaganda is so useful and so powerful, and it became a very powerful instrument during the First World War. Like this one. Okay, it says, come and do your bit. Your bit, well, the thing is, if you're living in this country, you have to fight for the country as well. Quite simple message. Thing is, just look at his face. He's smiling. And there's a reason why he's smiling. He's giving you some kind of feeling, okay, this word sounds like fun somewhere. So it's quite important that I'm there as well, because I don't want to miss that kind of party. And you all can read it in his face, say, yeah, lovely, I have to be there as well. I don't want to be a coward because my friends are going, so I want to be there as well. So this was one of those things, bring a positive message about something horrible. And by just smiling in your face, well, it really helps. Another thing, and I strongly believe this is one of the most powerful parts of propaganda. You have one poster right here, destroy this mad brute. This is how they were trying to convince America to take part of the war as well. But if you just look at the poster, what they're trying to do here is to make a difference between us and the others. And the message is quite clear right here. The others, they are monsters. We are the good ones, they are the bad ones. We'll kill those bastards and everything will be fine again. So they're the reason that everything goes wrong, so we have to kill them. And if you create them as monsters, it's even more easier to do. Also quite important, something like this. It's also quite simple, but if you look in his eyes, you can see some kind of feel, okay, we're doing well, everything is going well, everything is going good. So you need to convince the people at home that what happens on the front line, well, it's like it was planned it would go. So every small battle there was, and they had some kind of victory. Yeah, look at it, we're doing well, so trying to convince your people that everything goes well, definitely. People had a kind of a feeling they had to be there, they had to enlist. And if they wouldn't, well, other people would say they were cowards. That's the kind of spirit that was started after a while. The 27th of April, 1915, it was the first time they used gas as a weapon. When the gas cloud was gone, Germans were jumping out of the trenches and just were walking through no man's land, and yeah, they would find the result of that new weapon. Even on that moment, soldiers were asked to take pictures of the victims of that new weapon, and they even used those pictures on postcards. So people at home were receiving postcards with the victims of the gas attack with the message, all's going well, we're winning the war, keep on going on. So they already knew how powerful pictures could be, and there were even that kind of picture were used in a kind of message, okay guys, we're winning the war. For my opinion, the story winning a war is quite strange to hear, because for my opinion, you never can win a war. You will always lose.
A few hours after the war between Britain and Germany had begun, the Alert, a cable-laying ship, began cutting all 5 cables from the seafloor that led from the German port of Emden to Vigo, then onto the Azores and the USA. The cables were cut and Germany lost all telegraphic links to the world beyond continental Europe.
The telegraph was a device that revolutionized long-distance communication. It worked by transmitting electrical signals over a wire laid between stations. Samuel Morse developed a code that assigned a set of dots and dashes to each letter of the English alphabet and allowed for the simple transmission of complex messages across telegraph lines. In 1844, Morse sent his first telegraph message from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore. A map of Europe from 1856 reveals the extent of telegraph lines on the continent. By 1866, the first telegraph lines was laid across the Atlantic Ocean from the USA to Europe. By 1901, telegraph cables from Britain stretched to all corners of the globe, forming a massive international communication network of around 100,000 miles of undersea cables. In December of the same year, an inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, successfully sent his first message wirelessly across the Atlantic Ocean from England to Newfoundland. The value of wireless communication at sea was dramatically demonstrated by the Titanic disaster in 1912. Large ships were now being fit with wireless sets, and at least one operator was included amongst the crew.
At the beginning of the war, the most powerful world navy, the British Grand Fleet, enforced a blockade of Germany. Warships patrolled the English Channel and the 200-mile gap between Scotland and Norway, denying German ships access to the Atlantic Ocean and the world's trade. These were some of the most sophisticated undertakings of the war that attempted to force the German military into submission. As the German surface fleet was cleared from the seas, the German naval strategists turned to the U-boat as a way of striking against valuable British ships. The Germans focused more heavily than any other country on employing wireless communication. Wireless towers were erected in German colonies in Africa, East Asia, and the Pacific. The transmitting installation at Nauen, just outside Berlin, was the only European station capable of reaching North America at the time. These intercepted German naval signals were a reason for concern for the members of the intelligence division of the British Admiralty. Hundreds of messages containing rows of meaningless letters and numbers were arriving daily at the Admiralty, which prompted the assembly of a team settled in room 40 that would try to decrypt these messages. Y stations were set up to intercept the signals. They collected radio traffic and then dispatched them to room 40 for processing. For 3 months, the experts at room 40 could not make sense of the intercepted messages. Then they had a stroke of luck. The first of those occurred on August 26th, when a German light cruiser, the SMS Magdeburg, got beached on the Estonian coast while sifting through a thick fog. It was paired with another light cruiser, which then tried to pull the Magdeburg back into deeper water. However, before it could do that, 2 Russian cruisers appeared and captured the Magdeburg. This was done so swiftly that the captain of the Magdeburg didn't have time to destroy the German codebooks. The Russians were able to recover 2 copies of the signal book of the Imperial Navy. They understood the significance of their discovery and sent one of the books to the Admiralty in London. The book contained over 300,000 three-letter codes, each one referring to a plain language word. Another codebook, the Handelsschiffsverkehrsbuch, was provided by the Royal Australian Navy, which it had taken from a German merchant ship passing through Melbourne Harbour. These codebooks aided the crew of Room 40 immensely in that they gave a notion of how the German encoded their messages. With this new knowledge, Room 40 was able to crack other German codes very soon and eavesdrop the radio traffic. One of the greater discoveries was the Germans' attempt to destabilize the British Empire by appealing to millions of Muslims in India, North Africa, and the Far East to rally against the British, which never materialized. Another success of the Room 40 was the uncovering of the spying and sabotage that the German government had unleashed on the United States soon after the war broke out in Europe. It was the Room 40 that famously took on and cracked Zimmermann's code.
After the bloody trench battles in northern France and Belgium in 1916, German military made a decision to bring Britain to its knees by a campaign waged not on land but at sea, and directed not against the British fleet but against merchant shipping, neutral as well as allied. The U-boat would be employed to starve Britain into submission. A few doubted that such a measure would bring the US into the conflict. The German Foreign Secretary Arthur Timmermann was determined to be ready for such an eventuality. A top-secret message was sent from Berlin to the German ambassador in Mexico. Germany offered, if the war with the US broke out, money to the Mexican president Venustiano Carranza in consent for Mexico to regain the states of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, which had been conquered by the US in the War of 1946-1948 with Mexico. The telegram was encrypted in 0075 code, which had been used since 1915 in some posts in Europe. Codebook 0075 was sent to Washington in November 1916 by the U-boat Deutschland, but not to Mexico. The U.S. State Department generously provided for peace effort transmission of the German-coded messages since 1915 on its diplomatic cable. The telegram left Berlin at 7:50 p.m. on 16th of January. A copy of the message was given to the cryptographers in the room 40. The first partial decipherment appeared around 10:30 a.m. the next day. On 19th of January 1917, at the German embassy in Washington, a crowd of 7 clerks encrypted the telegram in 13040 code, which was older and well known for the experts in room 40. The British embassy in Mexico City had a source inside the local telegraph office, and a month later an acquired copy was sent to London. The telegram was fully deciphered immediately and presented to the U.S. ambassador in London. President Woodrow Wilson, unsure of what to do, saw confirmation of the authenticity. Unbelievably, Zimmermann himself confirmed that the telegram and its anti-American rhetoric were genuine. On 1st March, Wilson chose to publish the telegram in several newspapers. The American public, already shocked by the submarine campaign, saw this as a virtual declaration of war and demanded an American response. It was the great British success, both in cryptology and diplomacy.
The trench warfare was never established as the main feature on the Eastern Front. The length of the Eastern battlefield was more than double than that on the West. There were many more guns and men per meter on the West. Roads and railways were markedly inferior in the East. The consequence was that the Eastern Front saw more battles of maneuver than the Western. All that made the wireless extensively used as means of communication. Russian enciphered military messages were regularly cracked, which contributed substantially to the Central Powers' victories on the East. Russian cryptologists used a version of Vigenère cipher. Ciphers are algorithms for performing encryption and decryption. There is a difference between ciphers and codes. Codes substitute a whole word with new characters whose meaning can be revealed only with the use of codebooks, while a cipher usually depends on a piece of auxiliary information, called a key or sometimes cryptovariable. A key must be selected before using a cipher to encrypt a message. To illustrate this, if there was a message with the order, demolish the breach, and if the keyword was orange, then the strings from the word orange would be written exactly under every string from the message. With help of the Vigenère cipher, the combination of those letters can be searched in a table and decrypted. The Germans used the most complicated cipher in the world, the ADFGFX code, but even such an exceptionally difficult cipher was broken in June 1918 by the French decoders.
In the beginning of the World War I, British and French armies were skeptical about wireless and found it unreliable. So they searched for secure methods of communication and started communicating through telephone. Unfortunately for them, in early 1915, Germans invented a listening device called the Morse sets that could eavesdrop on elite phone activity. When the French telephone lines were buried underground and the signals were sent, Morse translated them into their original form. The Morse sets mean that Germans were forewarned and had time to organize defensive capability, knowing the exact locations of the series of assaults by the French during 1915. Brigadier General John Carteris noticed how the Germans clearly had some source of information. On the 23rd July, during the Battle of Somme, General Staff noted that there was clear evidence that the German system of overhearing was being used. It was discovered that the Germans had acquired a complete copy of the operational orders of the British Corps. On the October of 1915 appeared the manual, The Indiscreet Use of Telephones, but it was too late. The Morse sets were still able to identify 70% of British units deployed over the course of battle. The ultimate solution to this problem came in the end of 1915 when Captain A.C. Fuller invented Fullerphone, which main feature was that the transmissions were practically immune from overhearing.
At the outbreak of the war, many nations had a weak or fledgling national intelligence community. European governments maintained trained intelligence forces, but central agencies which would process information were still in their infancy. Many times information provided by intelligence services was wasted or misinterpreted. The interception and decoding of information remained crucial for the Second World War and later the Cold War. The techniques used by intelligence today, such as electronic bugging, spy satellites, and computers, are the basis of surveillance society we live in.
In 1914, the airplane was less than 11 years old. Although people were fascinated by this new technology, the planes generated skepticism when it came to its practical applications. It was quite a radical idea to use aviation for war purposes, but this would change over the course of the war. 4 main types of airplanes were used throughout the First World War: bombers, fighter planes, zeppelins, and perhaps the more significant but less appreciated reconnaissance planes. Aerial reconnaissance aircrafts are manned or unmanned aircrafts designed or adapted to carry out aerial reconnaissance. The first reconnaissance flight took place on the 23rd of October in 1911 by Captain Carlo Maria Piazza during the Italo-Turkish War in Tripolitania. It was not until the First World War that it was used at a much broader scale. Aerial reconnaissance made a big leap during World War I. This was because for the first time in history, one was able to look across the river on the other side of the hill or the other side of the trenches and slightly under the surface of the ocean, which let aviation forces become more than just an assistance weapon to the ground forces.
You have to know that at the beginning of the First World War, it was a war of movement. And as soon as the war of movement changed into a stalemate in the trenches, the traditional means of gaining intelligence on the enemy, being the cavalry and espionage, they failed. They couldn't see, they couldn't go beyond the front line. So the armies needed new eyes to see what was beyond what was visible on the ground. So a few pilots started to experiment with their own private camera gear. They took their own camera gear in the air. They took photographs and they experimented with it. And already from mid-1915, it was soon found out that aerophotography was one of the best means of gaining intelligence on the enemy. So from 1915 onwards, it rapidly developed, and by mid-1916, it would be standard to photograph the entire front line every couple of weeks. So you have to imagine that pilots were flying at kilometers altitude. They were in freezing cold, high in the sky. They were flying above enemy territory. They were being targeted by enemy aircrafts. So they were looking around in the sky. They were also finding the right spot on the map where they were. They had to fly to that spot, load their camera. Those were glass plate negatives. So in the beginning of the war, they manually had to change the glass plate, put it into the camera, point it down, and then take the negative out, put a new glass plate in it, and then repeat it time after time. And then I had to go back to the aerodrome, develop the photographs, and take the photographs as quickly as possible towards the person who ordered the photographs, and get them developed so that they could be read. Somebody had to do the air photo interpretation, had to get the meaning from the photographs, and pass on that information to those who had to get the information. It was important to any battle, because without the aerophotography you didn't know where the enemy was. If you don't know where the enemy is, you don't know what to attack. If you're doing a battle, the first thing you have to do is take out the enemy artillery. Without the aerophotography you don't know where to shoot at, you don't know where the targets are. So without aerophotography, no accurate artillery. Without no accurate artillery, no offensive could take place. So aerophotography was important to anything that had to deal with day-to-day stalemate in the trenches and the preparation of offensives. Like any battle, aerophotography was constantly being used during battles. For instance, now we are in 2017, 100 years after the Third Battle of Ypres, and during that battle, every time when photographs could be taken, photographs were taken to see how the offensive advanced, to see where the troops were going, where they were actually stationed. Imagine that you're a soldier in a landscape full of mud, full of pools with craters. You didn't know where you were. So what you do is you put on signal boards. You put on those signal boards, and there were contact patrol aircraft flying low over the battlefield and photographing where the positions were. So by taking those photographs, the positions of the troops on the terrain could be mapped. From the air, it's much more easy to see where somebody is than on the ground yourself. Air photographs have almost for 90 years been forgotten a little bit. Why is that? It's because they were high-tech military intelligence at that time. And just like nowadays we don't know anything about the highest military technology, the newest satellite imagery, it was also the same thing in the 1920s. People didn't tell much about aerophotography, but it was still modern and high-tech technology at that time. So aerophotography was a little bit brought towards the background. All the attention went to the fighter aircrafts, the German aces. There were heroic stories of knights in the air and stuff like that, and the aerophotographs were forgotten in the archives.
And probably the greatest stride in the First World War was in the process of photo interpretation, of understanding what you could see, how shadows reveal all sorts of things you might not expect when you're looking vertically down something from a great height. You could measure the size of objects from the shadows they cast if you know the time of day, the location, the photograph. You can see barbed wire, for instance, shows as a slightly darker colour on a black and white photograph. I would say the achievements are twofold: the technical achievements of improving lenses and the, if you like, the intellectual achievement of understanding what can be seen and really building a new science, the science of photo interpretation, which was quite new. Nobody ever needed to do this before. Nobody really ever thought about it before. The form of warfare spins off the process of observation, because if your observation planes are going to come under attack from enemy fighters, then you need to develop your own fighters to protect your observation planes. And this leads, as I say, to a new form of warfare, aerial combat, dogfights. If the public were fascinated by that, as they were, it shouldn't ignore the fact that the core process, the core function of aviation during the First World War was still observation, and the whole of the aerial combat was simply a spin-off, a sort of sidetracking, really, from their main function to get over to the other side, take some photographs, and then to get back home again. I think there's no doubt that aviation was still very, very young in 1914. Remember, the Wright brothers had only flown for the first time in 1903, and that was for about 50 meters. It was a tiny little hop. I don't think they got higher than 30 feet. They flew for about 50 meters. By 1914, the British military had, I think it was 272 aircraft. This was very, very primitive. Aircraft, if they tried to fly into a strong wind, would often end up moving backwards. Their engines were so low-powered, understandings of aeronautics were still very basic. There were really kites that had people in them. That was what a very, very small engine in 1914. By 1918, there's been an enormous rapid development of aviation. There are thousands, tens of thousands of aircraft being built. Engines are much more powerful. Scientists have been studying the whole science of aviation, of avionics, of aeronautics. They've made great strides forward in understanding.
At the start of World War I, the transition from pure to applied science began. Technologies developed during the war have left a significant legacy still affecting our society today. Although aerial photography began prior to the war, it was still rather insignificant, and it was during World War I that it became much more relevant. People failed to realize how vital aerial reconnaissance was through the First World War and what mark it has left.
All of the animals had come out of their holes to die. Dead rabbits, moles, rats, and mice were everywhere. The smell of the gas was still in the air, and it hung on the few bushes that were left.
They saw this grayish, yellowish cloud coming up to them, and they were still naive in the sense they were pulling the triggers, they were still firing, aiming at that enemy, but it was naive of them. Some of them just had the logical reaction of fleeing, just leaving everything behind in the trenches and just flee in the direction of the gas. Others were very stubborn and tried to move on, but they choked, they suffocated.
Such horrific experiences were what soldiers had to endure during attacks with chemical weapons during World War I. The development of these weapons changed warfare and the psychological and physical effects it had on soldiers. Its use ultimately resulted in many horrific deaths. Interestingly, purely killing people was never the aim of chemical warfare. Instead, it was meant to weaken the enemy and make it vulnerable to further attacks. This was due to the fact that the significance of the weapons was strongly underestimated throughout the war. Same was the case for chlorine gas to be used in trench warfare. It was experimented with by German chemist Fritz Haber, who took into consideration that chlorine gas was originally used regularly in order to bleach clothes. However, it was later on discovered that the chlorine gas acts harmfully to the skin and causes shortage of breath. The idea was therefore exploited by Haber and later on led to the development of chemical weapons. Interestingly, Haber's wife, Clara Immerwahr, also a dedicated chemist, repeatedly tried to convince her husband of the power and inhumanity of her husband's proceedings. Because Haber did not respond accordingly, Immerwahr took the ultimate step to commit suicide in order to finally convince her husband of her view on the issue. And nevertheless, Haber continued working on the production of chemical weapons in the First World War, despite his wife's desperate act. And as a result, chemical weapons in form of gases were produced continuously.
So this is a German example of 1917, made out of lamb leather. And then they already had filters that could be, screwed off like this. And they were filled with, most of the time, like charcoal. Charcoal could, neutralize the gas smell for a while. But after a while, you have to, do it off. And then hold your breath, do a new one on, and then you could breathe again. So that was terror too, the fact of needing to have one in your, close by was hell too, and even the fact of wearing one.
The physical pain soldiers were exposed to was certainly cruel to the worst extent. The gases used caused suffocation, heart malfunction, third-degree burns, and worse. And cruelly, this was the exact effect wanted. The soldiers were never meant to be killed with the gas directly, as they were supposed to suffer and be weakened in order to be vulnerable to further attacks. Thus, chemical weapons were rather a method of torture than an actual weapon functioned to kill. The warfare in World War I can be described as not only physically, but also psychologically tormenting. Due to the chemical weapons soldiers firstly weren't used to, they endured enormous psychological damage as the feeling of suffocating and burning skin were unbearable, and there was no sufficient knowledge about the gases, at least in the beginning. And therefore in combat, soldiers were terrified of the gas since there was no sufficient way to escape the green or yellow-colored smoke. And even the previously mentioned protection was a psychologically harmful experience, as the gas masks only intensified the feeling of suffocation and made it nearly impossible to see clearly. And as a result, soldiers were left helpless in battle and had the chance to either proceed in the battle further or try to escape and be marked as a traitor.
How would you be? I always, when I give workshops to youngsters, the first time you are involved in a gas attack, first time was a chloride gas attack. Soldiers on the other side of the trenches were having the feeling of choking, suffocating. They couldn't get any breath anymore. So it must have been terror. They were terrified. So some of them fled immediately. Other ones stayed because they wanted to go further and obey the orders of their ordinances. They were terrified. And then those who survived were able to say it to or tell it to other ones. So they were terrified.
Due to the severe psychological and physical damage caused by the gas attacks, various political measures were taken in order to prevent such violations of basic humanitarian principles. Furthermore, the exploitation of laws was supposed to be avoided as well, as Fritz Haber exploited the regulations that existed in the time period of World War I.
During the early stages of the First World War, soldiers started reporting strange behavior among their comrades. Actions like dizziness, headaches, fatigue, unexpected cramps, tics, palpitation, and being hypersensitive to noise started to become more common, and were related to the phenomena railway spine as the symptoms were similar. After 5 months of the gruesome war, it was reported that 10% of the British officers and 4% of the soldiers carried such behavior. The first time these behaviors were defined was in February 1915 by Charles Myers, an anthropologist and consulting psychologist to the British Expeditionary Force. He defined it as shell shock and stated that the disease was caused by an explosion of a bomb, a busting of a shell, and trauma. Myers set up 4 receiving centers and discarded the term shell shock, introducing methods of individual physiotherapy, including hypnosis as acute treatment. Despite this interpretation, the army viewed this behavior as a contagious psychological response of the weak to protracted fighting. Treatment methods varied greatly as the doctors were dealing with what they felt was a whole new and unexplored category of mental illness. Everything from re-education, anesthetics, intensive massage, hydrotherapy, electroshock therapy, the talking cure, etc. Most treatments were meant to prove to the shell-shocked victims that he was still in control of his body. Example, if a patient displayed symptoms such as speech disorder, he might be given singing lessons. Some treatments were, however, much less humane. Electroshock therapy was feared by most soldiers. If a comrade started displaying symptoms of shell shock, the surrounding soldiers would attempt to somehow fix him by poking, ticking, or otherwise hurting him until the symptoms would subside. This was all done to prevent the shell-shocked victims from being taken to the doctors. One of the reasons of the diverse range of treatment was that the illness caused a lack of soldiers. At this point, the doctor's finest job was to treat the soldiers as fast as possible so they would be able to return to the front zones, although many failed to do so. The disease was fairly new, so no treatments had been discovered. Doctors had to use the knowledge they were given to test their way towards a cure. As very little sympathy was shown to these soldiers, treatments were often brutal and long-lasting, leaving a large number of men dying during the recovery process.
Soldiers with shell-shock symptoms were seen as weak and cowards. Many would consider them to be lying to escape the war. When walking past these victims, many would also bow their heads and not look at them. Family relations would be disgraced by these men, and some would even neglect them completely. In contradiction to this, by the beginning of 1916, some started to change their opinion about such soldiers towards a more accepting way of thought, as it was announced that about 1:6 of the men in treatment was an officer. But it was still a minority of people who changed their view, and it wasn't until long after the war people started acknowledging that this was a disease and not just cowardice. By the mid-1916s, it had been discovered that the previous preferred harsh and careless treatments often contributed to further damage and endured trauma. The general view of the disease was moving towards it being a psychological damage rather than a physical one, and many doctors approached new methods of treatment with Dr. Arthur Hurst in front.
In fact, 90% of his patients were cured in one session using his revolutionary treatment, such as hypnosis, persuasion, massage, and dietary treatment.
What you have in the First World War, and that's a very important thing of warfare, is that many armies were opposing each other on the same spot for many years. They didn't move on, they just made small changes in front lines, but you didn't have that very dynamic way of warfare. And that caused that a completely new way of psychological pressure was put on those who were in the front lines. And in that environment, which was quite unnatural, you had no man's land, destroyed buildings, destroyed environment, trenches, they were in constant threat. And so you were never actually quiet or in rest. So many people broke down because of that. Also, the environment was quite unnatural and something they had never seen before. There were corpses, the smells were horrible, there was noise, you had all those sort of things. So that complete unnatural environment actually was also a very major cause for nervous breakdown.
In 1917, there were developments in finding the cure, and better care for patients were established as time passed. Soldiers would be placed under the care of neurologists and recuperated until discharged or returned to the front. Some officers were sent away for a period or more, often to privately funded treatment centres such as Lennell House in Coldstream in the Scottish Borders country. Although these discoveries had been made, 4/5 of the men who entered treatment were still never able to return to duty. After the armistice in 1918, the survivors were even more reluctant to discuss or write their experiences for fear of bringing back the traumatic memories. However, some soldiers felt they could express themselves through artistic manners, such as letters and poems.
We had strict orders not to take prisoners, no matter if wounded. My first job, when I had finished cutting some of their wire away, to empty my magazine on 3 Germans that came out of one of their deep dugouts. They were bleeding badly, begging for them to be put out of their misery. They cried for mercy, but I had my orders. They had no feeling or whatsoever for us. It makes my head jump to think about it.
It wasn't until 1936 an actual cure was found. Lobotomy was introduced and performed on a number of shell-shocked victims, inspired by leucotomy, where a hole would be drilled into the skull to have access to the brain. It manually removes excess emotion and stress. This was done by cutting certain nerves in the brain. The brain was accessed through the socket of the eye, whereafter a small hole was created in the orbitoclast, which is an area of the skull that is very thin. Though the treatment initially provided great results, it was ultimately banned due to severe side effects. Shell shock is the only medical concept originating from wartime experience that has moved on to become a powerful metaphorical key to the historical understanding of war and innovation. Highly intertwined with British culture's understanding and memorializing of the Great War, shell shock has become a symbol of the dreadful experiences the soldiers had to go through in the trench warfare. As the term shell shock has now evolved into post-traumatic stress disorder, this disease is still existing in our time of age. It is caused by various reasons, such as stressful experiences that causes trauma, family heritage, or even just the way the brain regulates in response to stress.
Technological advancement was the outcome of the First World War due to its importance to the powers in terms of defense and attack. Nowadays, technologies that were created in those times are used both in our everyday life and at the state of war. What was originated in conflict and aggression is now a part of peaceful lives of citizens around the world. Militaristic inventions have evolved through times in neutral aid to humanity. However, a big price had to be paid for such improvement. Aggressive innovations, such as machine guns and chemical warfare, resulted in countless casualties and bigger ideas for even more deadly weapons. At the time, the exploitation of the new technology led to massive slaughter of innocent lives. In order to be aware of the consequences of the unknown, those lives have to be remembered by us and future generations as the victims of such rapid progress.